The 1980s was an exciting and innovative time for children's television. Beloved classic Saturday Superstore began airing in 1982, Grange Hill was at the peak of its popularity, Rainbow was still going strong, and the Thundercats were hard at work fighting evil on Third Earth. But in 1987, a brand new children's adventure game show would debut on CITV that would go on to become a cult classic, Knightmare. In a time when computer games were far less ubiquitous than they are now, Knightmare offered kids and viewers the chance to step into a fantasy world of make-believe, where they had to traverse a spooky, sprawling, fiendishly difficult medieval dungeon. With the assistance of Traegard, the dungeon master, and a whole host of characters they would meet along the way, the players had to use their wits to discover clues, dodge obstacles, and solve puzzles to beat the game. Taking inspiration from Dungeons & Dragons, the show featured cutting-edge technology for the time that brought a unique and immersive experience to the small screen. It was a groundbreaking format that captivated the hearts and minds of a generation. Throughout its 8-series run, Knightmare left an indelible mark on the childhoods of many, embedding itself in the collective memory of a generation. In this video, we'll delve into the captivating journey of Knightmare, exploring its inception, the groundbreaking technology that fueled its success, the unforgettable characters that brought the dungeon to life, and the lasting impact it has had on both the players and its dedicated fanbase. Before we get started, it would mean the world if you could subscribe to the channel and give the video a little thumbs up. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now settle in for a nostalgic trip back to the 1980s as we take a retrospective look at Knightmare. To understand what led to the development of Knightmare, we have to go back to the spring of 1985. Margaret Thatcher was halfway through her tenure as Prime Minister. Long-running soap EastEnders made its debut on BBC One, Muhammad Al-Fayed bought the London department store Harrods, and the Dire Straits album Brothers in Arms was released, which would go on to become the first compact disc to sell over 1 million copies. Around this time in Norwich, Tim Child, a journalist, reporter and development producer for Anglia TV, had come up with an idea. Tim produced a regular weekly review of the UK 8-bit home computer games industry and was inspired by the two ZX Spectrum games, Attic Attack and Dragon Torque. Attic Attack is a great game that takes place within a castle in which the player must seek out the golden key of ACG by unlocking doors and avoiding enemies. In Dragon Torque, the sequel to 1984's Avalon the 3D adventure movie, the hero of Avalon, Marok the Mage, returns to defeat an evil witch and save Britain. I played both games in research for this video and highly recommend them, particularly Attic Attack. After seeing these games, Tim realized that if the ZX Spectrum was capable of these kinds of adventure games, perhaps the same could work for a television game show. And with this, the initial idea for Knightmare was born. A Dungeons & Dragons style show where contestants would explore a fantasy dungeon with cunning puzzles and devious riddles, with the goal of reaching the end of the dungeon and winning the game. But having the idea was one thing, making it a reality would turn out to be quite another. In the mid-80s, computer-generated imagery was nowhere near what it is today, and creating a realistic atmospheric fantasy dungeon using only CGI wasn't really feasible. The Quantel Paintbox was a popular computer graphics workstation at the time, but at a price of $250,000, equivalent to around $800,000 in today's money, Anglia TV hadn't yet purchased one, making it an unviable option. Instead, Tim looked for inspiration elsewhere. Having spent time as a journalist reporting on the video games industry, Tim had seen the incredible cover art depicted on these games. And I must admit, some of the art on these games is absolutely outstanding. They just don't make cover art like this anymore. Tim recognized that he needed an artist on board to help create the dungeon rooms for the show, and so he contacted publishers to identify the artist behind some of the covers he admired the most, and learned the name David Rowe. David is a games industry legend who has produced iconic artwork for hundreds of computer games, magazines, and books over the past 40 years. And Tim realized he would be the perfect man for the job of bringing Knightmare to life. David and Tim would then start working together on ideas for Rowe to sketch and paint the dungeons for the show. To see David's work up close, I highly recommend picking up a copy of his book, David Rowe's Art of Knightmare, which has high-quality images of the dungeon rooms, original sketches, and words from David about his artwork. It's an incredible read and a must-have for any Knightmare fan. The next challenge to overcome in making the show a reality was how to add real people to David's sketches. It's all fine and well having incredible illustrations of dungeon rooms, but without any way for players to explore these rooms, it would all be in vain. The solution to this problem came from the weather, specifically television weather broadcasts. Being a former news journalist, Tim knew of the technology used to allow weather presenters to appear in front of the weather forecast, namely chroma keying, where the weather presenter stands in front of a green or blue screen, which can be digitally altered to show a graphical representation of the weather. Tim thought it was the perfect way to bring his creation to life. Rather than having expensive CGI or costly set designs, the show could be filmed in front of a blue screen, and the dungeons would be superimposed onto the shot. Using this kind of technology would mean the possibilities were endless. In order to solve the problem of having players move around within the dungeon, it was decided that all of the dungeon rooms would conform to a standardized grid that would make them isometrically identical to each other, enabling the blue screen room to remain virtually the same for each dungeon room. One of the things that really impresses me about Knightmare is that even knowing this, the dungeon rooms all feel incredibly different, and you couldn't really tell that it was virtually all filmed in front of the same blue screen. The last major issue to address was the Dungeoneer. If the entire room was blue, how would they be able to explore and interact with each dungeon room if they can't see it? Perhaps there could be a monitor off to the side for the Dungeoneer to watch as they explore, similar to how a weather presenter looks off to the side to a monitor to see what the viewers are seeing at home. Obviously, something like that wouldn't work here, and so Tim thought, well, if they can't see the dungeon anyway, why not just blindfold them and have some teammates guide them through the dungeon? Sometimes the simplest solutions are the best. And so it was decided that the Dungeoneer would don the helmet of justice that would blind them to the maze ahead. And with that, all of the pieces were in place to get to work on a proof of concept. The first tests of the chroma key technology took place in the autumn of 1985, and in this screen test clip from 1986, we can see a crew member walking around in one of the dungeon rooms in Studio A at Anglia TV. It is incredible to have surviving footage like this of the show's development. Prior to a pilot being filmed, Tim knew that like any good fantasy dungeon adventure, the show needed its very own dungeon master. And through a friend at Anglia TV, he met actor Hugo Myatt and thought he would make a great dungeon master for the show. Tim knew that Hugo was between jobs at the time and would take on this new challenge in the hope that it might lead to something bigger. And boy are we glad he did, as I don't think I could see anyone else portraying the Dungeon Master other than him. The first pilot of the show was filmed in early 1986 under the name Dungeon Doom. 15 minutes long, it featured Tim Child's nephew, two daughters of one of the Anglia TV team and one of their friends, as the first players. A second pilot was then filmed in January 1987 with a few changes. The show was renamed to Knightmare, and the on-screen life force was added to the show, something Tim had taken inspiration for from video game Attic Attack, which itself had a player health status in the form of a chicken. This second pilot proved to be a success, and the ITV Children's Committee, keen on putting something different and exciting on TV, decided Knightmare was worth the risk. An 8-episode first series was commissioned, and the rest is history. Let's now take a look at the general format of the show and how the quests through the dungeon worked. The object of the game was for players to get through the 3 levels of the dungeon without losing their life force and without dying, like falling down a pit as happened in this hilarious clip.
Simon,
yes.
Sidestep to your left.
Each team would consist of 4 players, 1 Dungeoneer and 3 advisors. At the start of their quest, the Dungeoneer would be blindfolded by the Helmet of Justice and guided through the dungeon by the advisors, who would remain in the antechamber and watch the adventure from the magic mirror. While each series had subtle changes to the rules or objectives, the overall format of each quest was largely the same. The Dungeoneer would enter the first room of the dungeon and begin their quest. Throughout the show, careful maneuvering was required by the Dungeoneer to avoid falling into a pit or being attacked by a monster, movement that was only possible from the advisor's directions telling them to walk or turn. As mentioned earlier, the Dungeoneer couldn't see anything, and so their surroundings would have to be described to them by the advisors. It was particularly hilarious how often this was started by, "You're in a room."
You're in a room.
You're in a room. You're in a room.
You're in a room. You're in a room. You're in a room. You're in a room. You're in a room. You're in a room. You're in a kind of room. You're in a 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 room.
Each dungeon room the team ventured into would have a different objective. Sometimes teams had to solve a puzzle, answer a riddle, or avoid danger. But most of the rooms contained some kind of clue that would help the Dungeoneer progress. For example, answering riddles correctly would provide additional information or hints. We'll take a look at some of the rooms in more detail a little later. Throughout their quest, the Dungeoneer would find food items which were used to feed the player's life force. Players would start each game with a green life force that would gradually lose energy throughout their quest, and eating any food item, done by placing it into their knapsack, would restore the life force's energy. If the player ran out of energy, they would lose the game. Other rooms contained objects that the players could carry and use in subsequent rooms. Players were only allowed to carry 2 objects at a time, and so it was imperative to obtain enough information to know which objects would be the most useful in the rooms ahead. Despite the Dungeoneer being blinded by the Helmet of Justice, they were able to see objects that were directly beneath them. In the final series, it became possible for Dungeoneers to carry objects in their knapsack. Players were sometimes also given magic spells to use during their adventure. These were used by spelling out the name of the magic spell, and they could only be used once, so it was imperative for the team to choose the right moment to cast it. Let's now take a look at each series of the show in turn, and explore the dungeon rooms that featured, the iconic characters the players encountered, and some memorable moments from each series. The very first series of Knightmare debuted on Monday, September 7th, 1987 on ITV. 8 episodes long, it featured a total of 6 teams on their quests through the dungeon. The dungeon contained a total of 22 different rooms, but not all of them featured in each episode, as it depended how far the Dungeoneer got. Teams usually started in the door option room, where they had to solve a puzzle or riddle to find the correct door. Among the level 1 rooms were the level 1 clue room, where the team could obtain items and answer riddles from Olgarth the Wall monster to receive clues for the quest ahead. Bomb rooms, which required quick thinking to evade the impending explosion of a bomb. And a number of rooms where the Dungeoneer would meet some of the other characters contained within the dungeon, such as Lilith the Sorceress and the Giant in his cave. After successfully navigating the level 1 rooms, the Dungeoneer would proceed to level 2. Level 2 also had its own clue room, where players could find more food and items, as well as Casper the Talking Key, who would help the Dungeoneers in subsequent rooms. Those rooms included the puzzle room, where the correct door had to be entered, the Hall of Spears, a room that required quick movement so as not to get impaled, and Merlin's Library, where the Dungeoneer would meet Merlin, and after answering his riddles correctly, he would grant the team magic spells to use on their quest. Only one quest in the first series was able to reach level 3, the trickiest part of the dungeon. The level 3 clue room was one of my favourites, as I absolutely love the artwork for this room. More items could be found in this room for the Dungeoneer to use during the last sections of their quest. After successfully navigating the Cavern White Cavern and the Gargoyle Room, the final room of the dungeon we got to see was the Wall of Jericho. We didn't get to see what happened in this room, as the only team that made it this far had unfortunately obtained the wrong item and were dismissed from the dungeon. Despite not beating the dungeon, this team were declared champions as they had reached the furthest out of all the quests. There were, of course, many other fun and interesting characters the team met along the way, including Folly the Jester, who gave clues and advice in riddles, Cedric the Mad Monk, who interrogated dungeoneers at the start of level 2, Gumboil, a guard that demanded a password in order to proceed, and Gibbet, who guarded the wellway to level 3. This first series of Knightmare was an instant hit, and a second series, twice as long as the first, was commissioned. The second series of Knightmare was double the length of the first, at 16 episodes, featuring a total of 13 quests through the dungeon. The dungeon's design is similar to the first series, but with a much wider range of rooms and puzzles. In fact, there were 39 different rooms in the dungeon, almost double that of the first series. Many of the rooms from the previous series returned, including the bomb rooms, Lilith's Domain, and the Corridor of the Catacombs in level 1, Merlin's Library, the Hall of Spears, and the Monk Room in level 2, as well as all of the level 3 rooms we saw in the first series. There were also a host of new characters introduced, including Gretel the Maid, Bumptius the Dwarf, and the first appearance of Mogdred, the main enemy in the dungeon. But would anyone be able to make it to the end of the dungeon and win the game? Well, thankfully this time around, 2 teams were able to do this. Let's take a look at the journey of one of those teams, Team 4. Mark the Dungeoneer and his 3 advisors Daniel, Matthew and Jonathan begin their quest at the Wheel of Fate, where they must pull the lever to choose the starting location. After pulling the lever, Mark enters the card room. Folly the Jester is dancing around in the middle, and he summons the challenge called Chase the Lady. The team had to choose the correct symbol to unlock the Queen, in this case the heart on the 3 card in the middle. Next, the Dungeoneer enters the kitchen, where they meet Gretel the Maid. Mark corrects her knowledge of the Knave of Hearts rhyme, and receives a clue as to which door is the correct one to enter. The next room is the level 1 clue room, which is guarded by Igneous the Wall monster. This is where the team has the opportunity to answer riddles to receive clues. The team successfully answered all 3 riddles and were able to gain crucial knowledge as to which items to take. They also learn that their quest is to free the maid, Gretel, whom they had met earlier in the kitchen, as she has been kidnapped. Following this, Mark enters one of the bomb rooms. Speed is the key here, and they are able to escape the room through the side door. In the next room, Mark finds Lilith the Sorceress fast asleep. Having taken the bell from the previous room, he rings the bell to wake her up. Lilith allows Mark to pass through her lair without payment. Through the passage, Mark is greeted by Gumboil the Horrid, who is guarding the entrance to level 2. Having picked up the gold from the clue room, they decide to bribe Gumboil into letting them pass. He reluctantly accepts, and Mark enters the well to be transported to level 2. Cedric the Monk is the first character to greet Mark in level 2, and he's not best pleased, throwing insult after insult at Mark. But it turns out Cedric is just lonely, he has no friends, and Mark is able to convince Cedric that he will be his friend. It took some convincing, but Cedric finally accepts, and accompanies Mark to the next room, where they encounter Gumboil once again. Gumboil tries to attack Mark, but Cedric comes to the rescue to protect his new friend and takes out Gumboil with his staff. The next room is one that may be difficult to watch for us arachnophobics. The giant spider Ariadne comes crawling across the roof. Cedric makes a run for it, but Mark is able to duck down to collect the first quest fragment, a letter F, and make it to the next room, which is Merlin's chamber. This time, instead of riddles, the team has to finish some well-known sayings. The first was, "A friend in need," and the answer is "a friend indeed." And the second was, "Today's enemies are," and the answer, "Tomorrow's friends." For their reward, they receive the spell Freezer, which will come in handy later. Before leaving the room, Mark picks up a ruby and a candle. In the next room, Olaf the Viking is on the bridge over Mogdred's Vale, and Mark is able to bribe him with the ruby to get past. Next, the team makes use of the freezer spell they received from Merlin to freeze the catacombite and retrieve the next quest fragment, the letter R. The next room appears to be pitch black, but thankfully Mark picked up the candle earlier and is able to illuminate the room, the well way to level 3. In the first room of level 3, Mark is able to gather a sprite of energy as cavern wights approach, before entering the gargoyle room. In order to progress in this room, they have to convince the gargoyle that he isn't ugly. The team also receive a spell from the gargoyle called Sun. In the next level 3 room, Mark collects the next letter, an E, and also meets Merlin again, who gives him another spell, Sleep. Next, Mark has to carefully and quietly navigate around some sleeping cavern wights to collect sprites of energy. Following this, Mogdred appears and tries to bully Mark into quitting his quest and joining Mogdred. Mark refuses his request and proceeds on. The next room contains a large stained glass window, and Tregard tells the team that it is wasted in the dungeon depths as there's no daylight down here. The team realizes that the spell Sun is needed here, and after casting it, the windows light the way to the next room. Mark comes dangerously close to falling to his demise in this room. Next, Mark finds himself standing on the mouth of a dragon. This is where Merlin's spell Sleep comes in handy, as it sends the dragon off into a deep slumber, and Mark is able to progress to the next room, the penultimate room of the dungeon. The next letter the team requires, another E, is located in this room. Straight ahead is a guillotine, with arrows signaling the way. The team are able to run through the guillotine and enter the final room of the dungeon. With their life force fading, Tregard reminds the team that Merlin had told them they must have one more spell, and it is of course Free, the 4 letters they collected through the dungeon. The team cast the spell, free Gretel the maid, and complete the dungeon. Mark, Daniel, Matthew, and Jonathan became the first team to defeat the Knightmare dungeon and were awarded the Silver Spurs of Squiredom. Series 2 of Knightmare was once again a huge success, and a third series was commissioned, also containing 16 episodes. The show also moved from Mondays to Friday afternoons, where it would remain for the rest of its run into the 1990s. Right from the word go, it is obvious that Series 3 is a clear improvement over the previous 2. Many of the rooms from the dungeons in the previous series returned, but there were a few new interesting rooms. A new opening room called Dice Room required the Dungeoneer to roll a dice, and as it slowed, the dice opened up to reveal 3 doorways to enter the dungeon. One of my favourite new rooms was the Lion's Head. This room wasn't always the same. Sometimes the Dungeoneer had to avoid laser beams that were being fired from the lion's head that would disintegrate the floor, and other times only a narrow pathway remained, which the teams had to navigate carefully. One wrong step and you're a goner, like this at the end of Quest 5. There were also new dwarf tunnels that were used to transition between rooms, as well as a new minecart tunnel that transported the Dungeoneer from level 2 to level 3. The series also saw some major changes to the characters, with many cast members from the previous series being replaced. Folly the Jester was replaced with Motley, who would give the team clues and help the Dungeoneer on their quest. Interestingly, Motley is the 3rd longest lasting character, after Tregard and another new character introduced in this series, Hordris the Confuser, a powerful sorcerer. At this point, it's probably worth mentioning the 3 different factions of characters in the show, namely the Powers That Be, the Opposition, and the Unaligned. The Powers That Be were on the side of truth and justice. These characters were usually happy to help Dungeoneers on their quests and work against the opposition. Characters in this faction included Tregard, the Dungeon Master, Casper the Key, Folly and Motley, the Jesters, Gretel the Maid, and Merlin the Wizard, plus a whole host more that we'll meet later. The opposition were the Evil faction, characters who opposed the Dungeoneers and acted as obstacles to their success, although some could be bribed for their cooperation. This faction included characters such as Mogdred, the Giant from Series 1, the Wall Monsters, Gumboil, and Lilith. There will be many more opposition characters we'll encounter later. And then there were the unaligned, characters typically on neither side, who were only interested in themselves. Cedric the Mad Monk from Series 1 and 2 was one of these characters, and there will be many more in future series. There were no winners on Series 3, but it is regarded by Knightmare fans as one of the best series of the show. It certainly did nothing to slow down the show's momentum, as it was renewed for a 4th series the following year. At the start of Series 4, we learn that Treguard has a new assistant in the antechamber, Pickle the Elf, played by David Lerner, who is best known for playing Marvin the Paranoid Android in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy TV series. Pickle manages the Book of Quests, gives status updates at the start of each episode, and is also keen on helping every team on their quest through the dungeon. I really liked Pickle and thought he was a great addition to the antechamber. Premiering on September 7th, 1990, the 4th series saw 8 teams take on a much changed dungeon. Having become frustrated by the room-to-room format of the show, Tim Child knew that a change had to be made. The pace of the quests was slow, and more movement and atmosphere was needed to elevate the show to the next level. Virtual reality was considered as a possible solution. Earlier in 1990, Tim had worked on a new show called The Satellite Game, an action-adventure show in the same vein as Knightmare, for which virtual reality had been used. However, in Tim's own words, The Satellite Game was not completely awful, but it was fairly dreadful. He stated that the virtual reality images used were just not up to the task and looked fairly disappointing. Tim said, "We learned enough to save Knightmare from a disastrous early experiment with this emerging genre." With that idea out the window, Tim eventually realized that if virtual reality wasn't going to work, maybe Knightmare could incorporate real-world locations into the show. The United Kingdom is full of medieval castles and ruins that could provide the perfect backdrop for the show and add a sense of realism and authenticity. With that, the team set out on photographing and filming a catalogue of castles, caves, barns and ruins from up and down the country that could be incorporated into the Knightmare dungeon. We'll take a look at some of these locations as we progress through the rest of the series. While the results of adding these real-world locations to the dungeon were mixed, it certainly improved the overall dynamics of the game and freshened things up, something that likely saved Knightmare from being cancelled prematurely. Now on to Series 4. Each quest in the series began in a new room called the Place of Choice, where teams were given 2 out of 4 possible quests to complete. The 4 possibilities were Sword, Cup, Shield, and Crown. The series also introduced a new item called the Eye Shield. When the Dungeoneer held up this Eye Shield, video footage would be shown of the Dungeoneer traveling between locations. This item was part of a side quest in which the Dungeoneer had to complete another objective, usually finding an object and returning it to one of the characters. There were a wide range of new rooms and areas in this dungeon, which had moved away from the hand-painted environments to a variety of real-world locations. The Weeping Doors tested the team's general knowledge by asking 3 true or false questions. A calling had to be announced for the door to start asking the questions. This would be provided by Pickle in level 1, but the team had to remember it for later levels. These doors were inspired by Leeds Castle in Kent, a truly spectacular building. There were quite a few locations in Norfolk that were used for the Series 4 dungeon, including Castle Rising, which provided the imagery for the rooms The Fortress of Doom and the Basement, Hawkering Wood in East Dereham, Norfolk, which is thought to have inspired the Forest of Dun, and Dragon Hall in Norwich, which provided the setting for the Crazed Heifer, a popular location in the dungeon that would provide teams with useful resources and information. Among the new characters introduced in Series 4 were a sorceress called Malice, who replaced Morgana as the second main opponent, Fatilla the Hun, a barbarian guard who guarded the Wellway in level 1, and Brother Mace, a jolly monk who would offer information and spells to the Dungeoneer. Of the 8 teams that took part in Series 4, only one was able to make it to the end of the dungeon and win the game, Team 6. At the start, the team chooses the path of the Crown. After successfully navigating level 1 and 2, the team found themselves in level 3, where Dungeoneer Dickon finds himself on a high platform and must carefully navigate the transporter pads to reach the door below him. In the next room, Dickon collects a bottle of poison and receives 2 spells from Hordris, Fire and Opposite. Next, they encounter a sorceress called Malice, who asks if Dickon would like to become one of her subjects. Interestingly, the team agrees, but Malice disappears. After making it through the corridor of blades, Dickon reaches a narrow bridge and is once again greeted by Malice, who again asks for Dickon's pledge. However, this time, Dickon refuses, and Malice begins destroying the bridge. Dickon safely makes it across to the other side. In the next room, they are able to defeat Malice with the fire spell they obtained earlier. But wait, the team's life force is low, and they have no food. All they have is a bottle of poison. Well, the team quickly figure out that the opposite spell will turn the poison into something they can drink without dying. After doing this, the team's life force is restored. And then, the team reach the final room of the quest, and they are able to retrieve the crown and be crowned champions of Knightmare, becoming only the 3rd team to achieve the feat. Series 5 of Knightmare was fairly similar to Series 4. The show continued the outdoor theme that had been introduced the previous year, only this time with a wide variety of new locations. However, there were a few differences that set it apart from the previous series. Firstly, there was no standard opening room for the teams to start in, and they would choose the quest they would embark on before they began. Also, the eye shield was now given to the team at the start, alongside the helmet and knapsack. Another new item was the spy glasses, which were used to spy on the opposition characters to obtain information. In terms of the locations, almost all of them were brand new. We had a new castle entrance, which used the entrance to Bodiam Castle in East Sussex, and Wolfenden, a village on the border of the Wolfglade Forest, which was based on the Weald and Downland Living Museum in Chichester, West Sussex. But perhaps the most interesting new addition to the series was Smirkenorf the Dragon. This provided players with a dramatic way to travel between locations. In Series 5, Smirkenorf was commonly ridden by players at the very start of their quest to reach the first location. There were many new characters that populated the dungeon in this series. Elita, the Cavern Elf, looked after Smirkenorf the Dragon. She tended to be quite rude and got under people's skin, but she could be very useful to Dungeoneers who gained her cooperation. Sir Hugh de Witless, played by Mark Knight, was a hapless but well-intending knight who had been cursed by Hordris the Confuser to rescue anyone he meets, whether they needed rescuing or not. He kinda looks like a character straight out of a Monty Python movie. But perhaps the most important new character of them all was Lord Fear, also played by Mark Knight. He was the new leader of the opposition, replacing Mogdred, who had held such a role in previous series. He was a very powerful sorcerer who had an influence on the dungeon and his army of minions from his headquarters. We didn't see him in the dungeon itself too often, but he could be seen through spy glasses. Almost every quest required the Dungeoneer to spy on Lord Fear to obtain the combination of a causeway or a password to reach the next level. As future series progressed, Lord Fear's headquarters would develop, becoming bigger and better each time. In Series 5, he resides in Mount Fear, but he would move in later series to the Black Tower of Goth and at the top of the Tower of Marblehead. Lord Fear would also hatch a plan at the end of each series to trap the Dungeoneer and destroy Knightmare Castle. For example, at the end of Series 5, he attempts to freeze the entire dungeon, but it backfires and he ends up with a frozen antechamber. Lord Fear's debut on the show certainly changed the overall feel of Knightmare, as there was now a main enemy who was determined to foil every quest at any given opportunity. Series 5 saw 9 teams take on the dungeon, but only one team was successful, Team 4. In a quest lasting over an hour, Ben, John, Ray, and Jonathan from Exeter were able to retrieve the shield and be crowned champions of Knightmare. Their prize was the Fright Night trophy, which looked particularly awesome. Series 6 kicked off on Friday, September 11th, 1992, and the overall structure remained largely unchanged from Series 5. The show had some new opening titles and music for the first time. In the antechamber, we still have good old Tregard and his assistant Pickle the Elf, but there were of course some changes to the dungeon and the characters within. Many locations from the previous series returned, including the Crazed Heifer and Wolfenden, but there were many new locations too. We saw dwarf tunnels back in Series 3, and they return in this series, except they are not CGI, but rather a purpose-built part of the set. They often contained a spyglass or clues to find, and Dungeoneers sometimes ran into some in-game characters down here. The Abbey Undercroft looked particularly spectacular. The setting for this room was the Fountains Abbey in North Yorkshire. Another interesting new location was Cloudwalker, a ship at sea. The vessel and its captain Numenor had been cursed never to find land. Interestingly, it is not known which vessel was used for the imagery of this location, but it always reminded me of the final boss ship in Donkey Kong Country. In terms of the characters in this series, many of the characters from Series 5 returned, including Motley the Jester, Elita the Cavern Elf, and Hordris the Confuser. We are also introduced in this series to Sidris the Confused, Hordris' daughter, a trainee sorceress who often gets herself and others into danger. Of course, Lord Fear returned, still hell-bent on stopping the Dungeoneers from completing their quests, as well as Skarkill the Goblin Master and Sylvester Hands. There were also a few new characters introduced, including the aforementioned Captain Numenor of the Cloudwalker, Awok, an oriental trader who provides teams with many items, spells, and potions, and Greystag, Queen of the Grey Sisters, the ruler of Witch Haven. While she was described by Tregard as being notoriously difficult to deal with, she was a sworn enemy of Lord Fear, and would provide Dungeoneers with useful information in exchange for something valuable. Of the 7 teams that took part in Series 6 of Knightmare, only one was successful in their quest. Ben, James, Alan, and Nathan of Team 5 were able to retrieve the crown and complete their quest in 55 minutes. The penultimate series of Knightmare once again has a very similar look and feel compared to the previous series, but there were a few major changes of note. Firstly, Tregard has a new assistant, Majida the Genie. At the start of the first episode, while Tregard is looking for Pickle the Elf, he accidentally releases Majida from her bottle. She says that Pickle has returned to the forest to be happy, and that she is Tregard's new assistant. Tregard is not best pleased at first, and Majida herself could be a little hot-headed and blunt, but as the episodes went on, she became more absorbed in the game and eager to help the Dungeoneers as best she could. Another big change was the helmet. The old Helmet of Justice was replaced with a new sleeker version with a visor at the front, which was introduced to accommodate a new feature of the game where certain potions and spells gave Dungeoneers the ability to share the advisor's view through the helmet. In terms of the dungeon, teams would now no longer have a choice of quests. Rather, Tregard would usually announce the objective of their quest before they began, allowing more time for gameplay and speeding things up a little. This series retained some of the locations from the previous series, including the Crazed Heifer, the purpose-built dwarf tunnels, beautiful stone courtyards, and the Abbey Undercroft. There were also many new rooms and locations that used imagery from Spanish castles. For example, the arches were from Avellaneda Palace, and the castle ruins included Cuellar Castle as the clue area in level 1, and the castle of Peñaranda de Duero in northern Spain, which dates back to the 10th century and is the oldest structure seen in Knightmare. There were 2 teams in this series that were able to complete their quests through the dungeon, and they did it back to back. Team 6 were able to retrieve the sword, and Team 7 successfully recovered the shield. But as Series 7 drew to a close, little did we know that there would only be one more series of Knightmare remaining. The final series of Knightmare premiered in the afternoon of Friday, September 9th, 1994, and it is regarded as the series that almost never happened. Tim Child had had 2 meetings with ITV and was able to secure the 8th season, albeit at a shorter program run of only 10 episodes. The show was to be transmitted back-to-back with its potential successor, Virtually Impossible, which was also produced by Tim Child's company, Broadsword Television. That show failed to live up to expectations, but perhaps that's a topic for another time. In terms of the final dungeon, at the request of many fans who had longed for a return to the style of adventure seen in earlier seasons, the dungeon was now CGI generated. Trapdoors were used to move between levels, a return to the simplicity of Knightmare's well-ways from the early series. And a few rooms and locations from the previous series returned, including the Corridor of Blades, the Black Tower of Goth, and the Sewers of Goth. Among the characters that appeared were many returning characters from previous series, including Motley the Jester, who had appeared in Series 3 to 6, but was absent for Series 7. And of course there were some new characters, including Snapperjack the Fool Taker, whose riddles had to be answered correctly by the team to avoid him kidnapping the Dungeoneer, Honesty Bartram, a second-hand charms and potions dealer, and Stiletta the Warrior Thief, who was an excellent source of information for the Dungeoneers. 1 team out of the 7 that took on the dungeon were able to triumph on their quest. Let's take a look at their run through the dungeon. The 6th quest through the dungeon in Series 8 was the team of Dungeoneer Dunstan and his advisors Alan, Oliver, and Alex. Before the quest begins, Tregard and Majida bestow upon Dunstan his helmet, knapsack, and a new item in this series, the Reach Wand, which could be used to touch or open things from a distance. Tregard informs the team that their quest is for the crown, and Dunstan enters the dungeon. Dunstan starts in the Snapdragon tunnels, having to navigate carefully down the middle before reaching the level 1 clue room. Upon looking through the spyglass, the team learns that there may exist a shortcut from level 1 straight to level 3. The team decides to take a key and a blade from the objects available and press on. In the next room, they find Smirkenorf and Motley the Jester, who is trying to entertain the dragon. After Tregard hints that they should tell a joke, Dunstan comes out with this.
Excuse me, why did the dragon cross the road?
I don't know,
To get his pension.
but I don't get it.
Neither did the dragon, he wasn't 65.
That's classic, that is.
Dunstan enlists Motley's help to find Stiletta, and they proceed to the next room, where Dunstan finds some food to feed his life force. In this series, the life force is now represented by a pie. Stiletta finally appears after Dunstan offers her the blade, and she reveals that the shortcut is in Fireball Alley. She also charges Dunstan's Reach Wand with a Reveal Hidden spell. The next room is the aforementioned Fireball Alley. Dunstan uses the Reveal Hidden spell to reveal a secret door. The team guides Dunstan across the room and into the door leading to the Corridor of Blades. After some frantic screaming of left and right, and a couple of near misses, the team make it to the door at the end of the corridor and into level 3. After restoring his life force with some food, Dunstan is chased by a giant creature into the next room, which is the level 3 clue room. The scroll reads, "Welcome to level 3. Be quick and be quiet." And the items on the table are a lantern, a horn, and a bottle with Paladin written on it. There is also a spyglass, which Dunstan looks through to spy on Lord Fear. Fear states that he has fixed the red dragon, Baal Sheba. The dragon previously had two personalities that didn't get along, but it is now called Firestorm of Marblehead and will be sent to destroy Linghorn. Dunstan takes the bottle and the lantern and proceeds to the next room of the dungeon. Next, at the watchtower, they meet Maldame. They tell her about the impending dragon attack, and she offers her assistance to the dungeoneer if they need her later, by revealing her calling name of Spite. The portcullis ahead opens and Dunstan proceeds through. Dunstan now finds himself on the Golden Galleon, a vessel sailing across the Great Mire. After picking up some food, Dunstan falls through a trapdoor to the lower deck, where he runs into Motley and Stiletta. They have partnered to raid Lord Fear's bullion chamber and get rich, but they realize that they need a lantern, which Dunstan has. Dunstan sells the lantern for a key, and Stiletta gives him the rune lock combination to get into Marblehead. Then, as goblin horns sound to signal the ship's arrival at the docks, the team quickly exit the boat. Dunstan finds himself outside the entrance of the great fortress of Marblehead and are able to open the door using the combination given to them by Stiletta. Inside the fortress, they meet Snapperjack the Fool Taker, whose riddles they answer correctly. Next is the Fireball Room. They're able to open the door using the wand and quickly proceed to the next room as fireballs rain down on them. And finally, Dunstan enters the Quest Room, where Hordris is caged up and the crown they seek can be seen in the corner. Lord Fear appears and tells Dunstan to start begging while he prepares a few of his favourite fireballs. But Dunstan instead opens the Paladin bottle from the level 3 clue room and turns into a knight, and is able to repel Lord Fear's attacks, sending him fleeing from the dungeon. Dunstan then reappears in his normal form and frees Hordris from his cage before retrieving the crown and exiting the room. Dunstan and Hordris make their escape through the sewers of Marblehead and reappear in the antechamber, having successfully retrieved the crown. Dunstan, Alan, Oliver and Alex are crowned the final champions of Knightmare. Not only were they champions, but they were also the fastest champions, having completed their quest in just 35 minutes. Hordris states that their portraits will hang in the Hall of Fame, where precious few appear. And he's right. Across these 8 series of Knightmare, only 8 teams, 32 players in total, were able to say that they successfully defeated the Dungeon of Knightmare. The final episode of Knightmare aired on Friday, November 11th, 1994. The show's demise was the result of a complex interplay of events that unfolded in the early 90s. The first pivotal moment occurred in 1992, when Knightmare narrowly missed out on winning the Royal Television Society's award for Best Children's Programme. The award instead went to a BBC programme, in a decision criticised by a Sunday Times TV critic as a travesty. A win would have secured Knightmare for at least 3 more series, but fate took a different turn. In 1992, a new chapter had begun with the appointment of Dawn Airy as the controller of ITV children's programmes. She acknowledged Knightmare's quality, but also faced the challenge of changing demographics in children's TV viewing. By 1994, research had indicated a shift in the target audience from 6 to 15 to 6 to 10 years old. Older viewers were migrating to other forms of entertainment, such as video games, which posed a considerable challenge to shows like Knightmare. However, Dawn Airy left her position shortly after commissioning the 8th series of Knightmare, and was replaced by Vanessa Chapman. Vanessa had been a regional children's show producer at London Weekend Television, and one of her first jobs was to sit down for discussions and negotiations with Janie Grace, MIA Broadcasting's Chief of Children's Programming. Janie had been the favourite to replace Dawn Airy, and so the relationship between her and Vanessa was slightly strained. Series 8 of Knightmare aired in late 1994 and did relatively well in the ratings, but in early 1995, Tim Child found himself in a challenging position during negotiations with Vanessa Chapman and Janie Grace. Tim was asked to nominate which of the 2 programs, Knightmare or Virtually Impossible, Broadsword would continue producing in 1995. But there was a catch. If he chose Knightmare, then the 9th series would be its last. Tim recognized the need for Knightmare to transition to full virtual reality, which was not yet feasible, and with the new lower-aged environment of CITV, perhaps Virtually Impossible was the right choice. In the end, after weighing up the options, Tim decided to go for Virtually Impossible. There were attempts to move Knightmare to the BBC, but these fell through due to copyright issues, and a format rewrite titled The Sword and the Sorcerer did not receive a commission. And with that, Knightmare was no more. Its 8th series had proved to be its last, and one of the greatest children's TV programs of all time had come to an end, leaving fans dismayed. Although the final episode of Knightmare was broadcast in 1994, that is not the end of the story. Only 1 year later, the Sci-Fi Channel launched in the UK on November 1st, 1995, and one of the first shows it bought the rights to was Knightmare. Their broadcast rights license lasted for the next 3 years, and then Challenge TV would purchase the rights to certain series and broadcast them in the years to come. Between 2002 and 2004, Televirtual, the new name for Broadsword, attempted to revive the Knightmare format with Knightmare VR, which would use avatar technology to place the Dungeoneer in a full 3D computer-generated world. A £40,000 National Lottery grant for the programme was awarded in July 2003, but the programme was eventually shelved in May 2005. In 2013, actor and comedian Paul Flannery created a commemorative stage show called Knightmare Live that went on to feature at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. Also in 2013, Knightmare returned for a special one-off episode as part of YouTube's 2013 Geek Week. The entire episode is available on YouTube and comes highly recommended. Definitely check it out later. And finally, in 2014, a special Knightmare convention was held at Epic Studios in Norwich, where Knightmare was originally filmed, with guests including Hugo Myatt, Mark Wright, Clifford Barry, Iona Kennedy, and David Rowe. The event included Q&A sessions, workshops on designing dungeon rooms, and a chance to play the Corridor of Blades dungeon room using the original blue screen technology. I wish I had the chance to attend, but who knows, maybe there will be another convention in the future, and if there is, I will certainly be in attendance. As we conclude our journey through the enchanted tapestry of Knightmare, it's impossible not to be swept away by waves of nostalgia. This iconic show didn't just entertain, it etched itself into the very fabric of our childhoods. It pushed the boundaries of what was possible at the time and was truly revolutionary. And it's hard to think of another kids' TV show that has had such an impact. As we reminisce on the mythical quests and fantastical landscapes, back to a time when the echoes of Traegard's guidance were the soundtrack of our afternoons, let us embrace these cherished memories as portals to a bygone era, where the allure of adventure and the magic of Knightmare fueled the imaginations of an entire generation. To this day, Knightmare maintains a dedicated and loyal fan base, eagerly hoping for its triumphant return someday. And who knows, maybe Knightmare will return to our screens sooner than we think. We can certainly live in hope, but until then, we have a legacy of incredible television that can be enjoyed for generations to come. Thank you for joining me on this nostalgic journey. If you enjoyed this retrospective look back at Knightmare, please subscribe to the channel. Your support so far has been incredible, and I'm really pleased with the direction the channel is going. So if you haven't subscribed yet, I would love for you to come along on this journey with us. Let us know your memories of the show in the comments below, and as we close this chapter, remember, the adventure never truly ends.